That's okay.
Second.
My hand works. Okay. I would like to call the July 18th, 2024 meeting of the Land Use Advisory Committee to order. We have an agenda. Are there any objections or suggested changes to the agenda? Seeing none, we have an agenda.
I'll move to approve.
We don't need to approve the agenda, Jerry.
Okay.
But you can move the minutes for April 18th and May 16th. We didn't have a quorum last time, so we've got 2 sets of minutes to do if you'd be willing to move those.
I'll move to approve.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Are there any discussion, corrections, changes? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. We have minutes. So we don't have, hey Noah.
Howdy.
Grab your name tag and some pie.
Wow.
And we've got 2 information items today. The first one is the MUSA expansion criteria discussion. And we've got Mr. Rajas.
Good afternoon. Sorry, I was in back-to-back meetings all days, but I'm here today. It's my favorite one, I promise, my favorite meeting today.
Well, it's the only one that gives you snacks.
That is true. I'm Lisa Barajas, Executive Director of the Community Development Division, and I'm happy to be in front of you today to talk in more detail about and get your feedback around potential criteria for consideration for when the council receives requests for additions to the metropolitan urban service area that we may not already be planning for in local comprehensive plans. So before we get into that, I wanted to just provide a little bit of history on kind of how the council has evolved its use of MUSA for planning purposes, both on the for capital planning for the wastewater system, as well as how we manage land within the region. And then ground ourselves in our regional goals and land use objectives, and then turn to these potential considerations and look for your feedback, input, thoughts, clarity, and how we consider what we might do going forward. So before we go into much detail, I want to talk about specifically like what is MUSA. We define it each cycle in the regional development guide and in our in collaboration with our partners in water resources policy planning to specifically our wastewater colleagues. And MUSA is everything that is all existing development that's being served today by the regional wastewater services, as well as all of our planned development through our current planning horizon, which is 2040, that we have agreed in review of comprehensive plans to provide wastewater services to as identified in those local plans. So in some communities that will show up as covering their whole community, and other communities that MUSA line is more delineated at the regional level because they've said this other part of our community we're never going to plan for services for, or at least not within a reasonable long-term horizon that we see in any at this point. And just as a basis, our current water resources policy plan, we review against the densities we talk about in land use as being the conformance basis for our regional wastewater system. We review for council policies as well. And those include policies within land use and within wastewater when it comes to managing that growth, as well as in transportation right now as it relates to station areas, which Merritt will talk to you more about today. But the water resources policy plan identifies those content requirements as well as it relates to local wastewater plans that communities who are on the regional system also provide that local service and that local connection. And so we review those, and actually the council approves local comprehensive sewer plans as a component of local comprehensive plans. To conform to the water resources policy plan, communities plans have to accommodate that projected growth that we've agreed to, as well as provide those sufficient areas that accommodate that growth. We do recommend that communities consider preserving areas for post-2040 growth as well, especially on that developing edge. And that we are doing that growth at densities that are consistent with the council's policy plans. As you all know, local comprehensive plans are really important. It sets that local vision and identifies those priorities and issues and how the community will deal with issues in front of them and how they intend to address those. But it also defines, local plans define how a local unit of government will plan for that growth, whether it will be sewer service, and the staging that's associated with it, if staging is appropriate, and setting those vision and priorities for the local unit of governments. So going back into our Wayback Time Machine, when we first did Metropolitan Development Guide in this region, this was back when the council was not combined with our Environmental Services Division today, when the Waste Control Commission was a separate agency. So the plan was, while coordinated, was set a little bit differently, but the council, in its Metropolitan Development Guide, identified the Metropolitan Sewer Service Region. It was very loosely defined because we were in that period where the Waste Control Commission was addressing all of those dots on the map, which were existing various forms of wastewater plants that existed around the region at that time. That's when you could still discharge into lakes, not just rivers. And so you'll see a lot of wastewater plants around Lake Minnetonka, for example. There were a lot in that region, or in that section. The policies were primarily aimed at cleanup of water quality issues around the metro. That was the whole reason for forming the Waste Control Commission and the planning organization. That was the council. And it was in the 75 development guide that the council prohibited discharge of sewage effluent to all lakes in the metropolitan area. So it was the first step that had happened in. The planning was really focused on planning for a permanent treatment plants at that time and consolidation of a lot of these smaller units around the region. And really just the beginning of building out that system. There was not a lot of any direction to local units of government as it related to new connections or planning for land at that time it was really focused just really on fixing the system. When we got to the 1988 Metropolitan Development Framework, then the MUSA boundaries were more clearly defined. The plans had been consolidated, a lot of those issues were organized, and then there was more direction given to growth into that urban service area. So this is when that urban service area was actually defined, this is where we're serving, this is how we're going to direct that growth. As local plans were approved, the established line replaced the one that was in the 75 guide at that time. So we continue that practice today, really looking at local comprehensive plans to define locally what that MUSA line looks like within their community. The council had conducted a land supply analysis at that time and found that in general, that the MUSA included more than enough land to accommodate forecasted growth through the year 2000. And this is for the 88 investment framework. So you may recall at the time there was a national recession. There was not a lot of growth happening across the country, let alone in this region. And so it was only a limited number of communities who needed to update their comprehensive plans and the 88 cycle. The council was started to establish and identify any additional land that might be needed to accommodate growth between 1990 and 2000 to accommodate some increment of growth. That was the only addition to MUSA at the time. It was very limited. The 88 plan established policies for reviewing requests for changes to the local urban service area, including as it related to increasing the size of the MUSA, that the council will not agree to expand a local urban service area unless there is a demonstrated regional need and adequate capacity available in the sewer and highway systems. And then the plan further prioritized investments in regional wastewater infrastructure as focusing on the metro centers first of Minneapolis and St. Paul, then regional business concentrations, and then the fully developed area and reinvestment in those areas for maintenance and upgrading of facilities. There, again, not a whole lot of development demand at that time, so that context is really important as we think about going forward. They had additional guidance for the developing area that it should be planned, staged, and generally contiguous to existing development, and that system investment to serve additional residential land beyond the regional forecast will receive a lower priority than system investment to serve unanticipated economic development. This was also when the council had identified what they called freestanding growth centers, and that would be areas like Stillwater and Hastings and others that were growing but were not contiguous to the rest of the MUSA. And that was part of an approach for managing growth as well, that especially around that contiguity policy that they had. But because there wasn't a whole lot of change in 1988 and not any additional planning, this was before the Land Planning Act was updated to require decennial updates to local plans. In 1992, as development had started to pick up, the council started receiving more requests to expand MUSA, and more than they were expecting, and extending service outside of the Plan 2000 MUSA boundary that had previously been identified. The council had initiated a number of studies at that time and began the process of updating the Metropolitan Development Guide, but was only in the beginning of those phases. The development guide wouldn't be adopted until a couple of years after 1992. The council chose not to review any requests to expand MUSA beyond the 2000 line for fairness reasons also. They didn't want to have this first come first serve mentality. I think that was a very planful approach, and that they recognized that there was an important need to coordinate improvements across the region. This is also when the council first established in this policy a substantial impact and substantial departure standard, and what it meant to conform to the regional system plan. And then that standard that I mentioned previously in 1988, that carried through in this interim MUSA policy as well. In 95 then, this was the update that was in process at the time that the interim MUSA policy had been underway. At that point, the region was 2.2 million people. There was quite a bit of growth that had happened in a short period of time. And for the regional blueprint, the MUSA was further delineated and then was directed then to be further delineated into local comprehensive plans that all local governments were required to do at that time, with changes to the Land Planning Act that changed the new due date to 1998 and established a 10-year cycle for that work. The urban reserve was a new concept that was established in the 98 blueprint as well, and that outer edge was meant to be the region's urban growth boundary. That boundary was based on watersheds to allow that area to be served by more economical gravity sewers as well. The rural service areas were not intended for urban services. Those were more clearly defined. In the past, rural service area hadn't really been defined. It was just the urban area and then everyone else. And this plan became much more specific about the council's intent for rural service areas. The council had set a course of greater efficiency, cost reduction, and stabilization of user rates within the wastewater system, and so wanted to continue that work. And in the 2020 regional blueprint is when the council identified under what cases that they would consider extensions into rural areas. So again, areas that were not previously planned for having any urban services. And they identified that they would only do these in exceptional situations when there was a pollution problem that existed, that it has been demonstrated that the most cost-effective solution to the pollution problem is central sewer service, that capacity exists in the metropolitan treatment system to provide service to the affected area, and that any additional costs are borne by the jurisdiction requesting those services. As you might remember, development continued to boom into the early 2000s. And there was a lot of rapid growth, especially on that development edge and into the rural area. Even when I came to work at the council in 2007, we were seeing rural development without sewer service all over the place, and places that I think were even surprising to folks that weren't expecting that. And this was also in that time period when we were seeing a lot of growth, especially going up along the I-94 corridor into the neighboring counties in Wright and Stearns County. And so lots of rapid development happening at that time. There were a lot of requests for growing the MUSA and urban services for communities that we already had sewer service to. And of course, a lot of feedback from the development community that there simply wasn't enough land supply being made available, and that we needed to have consider how we were tracking and ensuring that we had sufficient land supply available to meet the growing development needs of the region. So it was in collaboration and in partnership that with Metro Cities, I think it was Association of Metropolitan Municipalities at the time, and the Builders Association of the Twin Cities, through a lot of conversation that the council both developed these Metropolitan Urban Service Area guidelines, as well as the plat monitoring program that we continue to have today, that tracks and monitors the development occurring within the developing edge communities. But these guidelines for evaluating plan amendments, proposing changes to MUSA timing and staging were more specific. They require that a city maintained and had an overall residential development density since the year 2000 to be at least 3 units an acre. And then identified how density would be calculated as a part of that, and what the strategies that now are part of our plat monitoring program, how we were going to set it up and track that monitoring. The guidelines also require that regional and local wastewater systems to have adequate capacity or staged capacity to accommodate that development staging being proposed, and that local governments have identified the available capacity of both regional and local systems to service the amendment. And if the city had identified inflow and infiltration problems, which was continued work that the council was doing in optimizing the system, had started at that time, that the I&I reduction plans were in place, and if we were going to be considering expansions into certain areas as well. Additional guidelines required that previous council actions and negotiations regarding the city's comp plan needed to have been fulfilled, and that the comp plan, or that the amendment land use needs needed to be consistent with the council's forecast for households and employment, or demonstrate the basis for the change of the proposed land use, and that the city should have a parks and open space system plan and strategies for implementation of best practice stormwater management plans, natural resources protection ordinances. It's very
Somebody's losing their hearing outside.
I can feel it in my bones. Goodness.
Very long red light.
It is a really long red light. I think those last two requirements around requiring parks and open space plans are in the best practice stormwater management plans, I think are interesting in that those were some of those considerations, especially around integrating stormwater management plans, were not added to the Land Planning Act until that change in the 90s that established requirements, that new decennial change made. And so it was a way for the council to reinforce what the statute had been included in there. And also, if communities were coming in and they hadn't submitted their plans yet for review, which would kind of moving after those 98 plans, that they had this other mechanism to help require those items. And then in the regional development framework being adopted in 2005, a lot of that previous work on MUSA implementation really informed that policy approach as well. Again, the MUSA line was further delineated here, but also by wastewater treatment plant. Those are all the different colors on this map, and this is still the approach the council uses in Thrive going forward. It helps us better understand where the service is coming from and what that capacity is, because we calculate that capacity by the individual plants. In addition to that, the long-term sewer service area, rather than urban reserve that was transitioned to a long-term sewer service area, was further refined. In the 2030 regional development framework, most of what was shown on our maps was illustrative in nature. So because the delineation was to be further refined by local comprehensive plans. So I do remember working in Hugo and working with their staff teams on that work during their comprehensive planning process of, we had the capacity to serve up there, but is that something you want to do? And the analysis that the city of Hugo had done was a really great model for that work of prioritizing what you wanted to accomplish and then seeing how can we engineer around that and is that what we want to afford. Was a really great model for that work. We don't have that long-term sewer service area identified in that fashion any longer because of the work that Hugo had done as an example in that area as part of their local plan. But we were continuing to boom at this time, tons of development happening all over the place. This was our peak year of development that we only recently retouched, I think, last year in a different way, but still the number of units that were being built at this period of time was the highest that they had ever been in the history of tracking that work. The long-term sewer service areas are that lighter color on this map. So if you look at the pink area as an example down in Dakota County, that dark pink is the existing service area, what was considered within the 2030 MUSA at the time. And the light pink is illustratively what could be served with the capacity within the treatment plant down in Empire.
And that big white donut hole in there is the Umore property, which is now being
Yes.
developed.
Yes.
We didn't presume to know what was going to happen there, especially back in 2005, just that something, figure it out. That tends to be the case with a lot of areas where we're like, yeah, it's still underway. The addition of the long-term sewer service area as opposed to an urban reserve was meant to be more flexible and guided by local units of government. At this point, there was also the requirement for contiguity of land was also removed from the regional development framework. We did begin early on, the council's practice back in the early 80s was to review for rolling land supply or a 20-year land supply, and then became more focused in the development framework process. And especially as we were using the plat monitoring program information to help track and monitor development as it was actually happening, as it was being subdivided. That's ahead of getting building permits. Obviously, we do building permits on an annual basis, but the subdivisions give us a better sense of what will happen and how much land supply is actually available. We continued these practices until the housing boom crashed. That was a big problem. Then we weren't worried about land supply anymore after that. But prior to that crash, we did update our MUSA implementation guidelines and really updated them in advance of the year of 2008 when local comprehensive plans were due to be submitted to the council so that they were reflective of the new directions from the 2030 regional development framework. They also identified how we were going to be calculating densities. This was much more explicit than what had been happening in the past. So establishing that we're using lowest allowable guided density for newly guided land, how the council considered things that were previously guided land to be considered approved and not re-reviewed. And then the purpose at that time was to allow for more local flexibility, to be more responsive to market forces, and really especially to give credit to local units of government where they were exceeding those minimum densities and basically acknowledge that performance so that you were building in flexibility in that process. And then that all crashed, and then we didn't have like any development for several years. It's actually, if you look at plat monitoring and building permits, we go like almost next to zero. Almost looks like we didn't do our work that year. When people sometimes ask, especially folks who weren't around that period, they're like, so were we missing data that year? Like, no, literally nothing happened. It was like total done. Nothing happened. And as we were planning for Thrive MSP 2040, because of that development slowdown and that slow recovery out of the market crash, and we were seeing overall lower forecasted growth going forward through 2040, that we also recognize that in doing that analysis, that within the 2040 MUSA, our 2030 MUSA, that we had sufficient land capacity to support 2040 forecasted growth. And that we were really, again, expecting that staging and timing of growth to be refined within those 2040 comprehensive plans. So this map looks a lot like the 2030 MUSA map, but you'll see those changes that I discussed on refining where the long-term sewer service area, you'll see it, the northern Anoka County is actually defined. We said somewhere up here we will provide sewer service, but we don't know where yet. But by the time we got through local comprehensive plans, then we had a more clearly delineated, this is where service will go, this is where the plant is, this is a long-term sewer service area. So really looking at how we're managing that land and timing it really closely with the types of, or the ability to provide service and matching that as closely as we can. Land capacity, as I noted, was much larger, and I know a lot of communities had to work on, in this process, work on identifying then what they had previously planned for staging, what it would mean in their local plans for how they would stage going forward through 2040, adding another decade, especially knowing that we had additional more land capacity than we had needed for a slower rate of growth. And since then, we've been updating our implementation guidelines to really reflect some of the things that we've been seeing for requests to connections to the system where we hadn't seen them previously. And that includes connections for failing communal systems, about what we count and don't count towards density. We've been seeing more of those coming through, especially just ahead of 2017 and especially in these last couple of years as well. Communal systems were often considered a good long-term solution for communities in rural areas, and they can be if they're very well maintained. But in some ways, sort of like a homeowners association and maintaining a building together, if you're not attentive to all those needs on an annual basis, those the maintenance or replacement needs then build up to be such that they become very costly over time, and or if they're not maintained, that they begin to fail. And then that cost of replacement of a failing system can be quite large, and more than I think many homeowners were expecting when they bought into those systems maybe 20 years ago or back in the 90s when those were beginning to be more popular. So we added that clarification, some other minor updates, and we intend to revisit this after the adoption of Imagine 2050 as our way of implementing those policies, but also responding to any changes or trends that we see in local development. Many of you will be familiar if you are in a MUSA or a developing edge that this looks like, what this looks like in a local plan, what staging looks like and how that's locally defined. This is Shakopee's plan, which includes not just their staging areas, but also integrates lands that are owned by the Shakopee, Minnewacan, and Sioux community, which are the purple lands there. Those lands are served by the tribe's own wastewater system generally. There are a lot of inter-community agreements between the tribe and Shakopee and others, and Private Lake as well, on services in that area. But that definition is down to a parcel specific, as you all know, if you have worked on your local comprehensive plan, when it comes to staging those urban services and drives that capital plan. So we review this staging to really ensure that those local plans align with our plans for capital improvements, and also we make adjustments to our plans as well if they are within what we expect for forecasted growth, within our parameters for density, et cetera. So moving forward, we see a couple of like two different application types when it comes to changes to the MUSA. The one on the left is about that expansion into rural areas where a community designation, a rural community designation, so our agricultural, diversified rural, rural residential, those designations that were not previously planned to have urban services are requesting to extend regional services for urbanized sewer service development. That's the largest part of what we're talking about today for these considerations. Not the local staging, not where we're already planning for sewer service growth in communities, but for where we're not planning for that and when we get those types of requests. We also see changes, as I've mentioned, to local services in the urban service area. For the most part, for a community I'll take Rosemont as example, you have staged areas already, and sometimes that staging might change. You might pull something from a later stage into a current stage. That's pretty common, but it is not the type of issue we're talking about today. We already were planning for growth, and you've adjusted that geography within your community. And we just look to ensure that because by sewer shed there can be localized constraints, we're looking for and ensuring that, yep, that's right, but you're not adding land necessarily by changing the staging. But there are some communities that are split, like Hugo or Lake Elmore or others that have defined rural portions of their community where they hadn't planned for urban services, and then the urban service portions of those communities. So adding geography to that would be part of what we would also want to consider, is if we hadn't previously planned for that, it's not part of a long-term sewer service area, but is planned as a rural designation, we would consider that as an expansion into that rural area as well. As I mentioned these a couple of times, but we track and monitor a lot of development across the region in a lot of different ways through plan amendments, which many MUSA changes do come through in plan amendments. It's usually not typically through a comprehensive planning process or the broader 10-year process, but through an amendment process. And that means they're often frequently are often driven by a specific development proposal that wants to be in that area. We also, as I mentioned, review rolling land supply through that plat monitoring program and continue to track densities there. And then we get development specific with those sewer connection permits. And then we track development just across the region through our building permit data too, so we can really see big picture trends. So before we moved into those considerations, I just want to ground ourselves in the regional goals and specifically around, actually I'm thinking about something else, but our regional goals around being equitable and inclusive, that our communities are healthy and safe, that our region is dynamic and resilient, and that we're leading on addressing climate change and protecting and restoring natural resources. But at our foundation is also our responsibility to be good stewards of the significant regional investments that we have in front of us, but also to ensure that we're not prematurely expanding our system before it will be needed. It's a cost that we bear today, and that our users, all of our residents bear today if we overbuild our system. And so we're really mindful of that. I also want to focus as we think about the footprint of development of the region. And we think about, I just wanted to remind us of these 8 draft land use objectives that you've seen before in this committee as well as we consider MUSA expansion criteria. In particular, objective 1 is core to how we're thinking about planning for land within the urban service area in partnership with our colleagues in environmental services. And our staff analysis of the capacity of land supply within the 2040 MUSA today, based on our local comprehensive plans and at currently guided densities, shows that we have sufficient land supply to support the region's development needs for more than 100 years. And that's that land supply that we've committed to already serve. So when we think about additions, and with that significant amount of land and considering our goals and land use objectives, we want to be sure that we are being good stewards of both our land and our infrastructure investments in this region. And those public investments that we've made. So as we've heard from our local government partners, we want to ensure that we're not overly restraining the land supply and impacting that price of land, because that impacts home values. And we don't want to encourage leapfrogging outside of the region either. So we're definitely well aware of being overly concerned, but we also want to be sure that we are building in criteria in the cycles that reflects being mindful of the cost of land oversupply and premature public investment for areas that may not yet be ripe for development. Some additional analysis that our staff had done on request for expansion to MUSA for the 2010 to 2020 decade shows that only about half of that land actually resulted in development and half of that land still remains undeveloped. I think it's about 5,000 acres of undeveloped land. So as we think about that service area, we really want to be mindful of that, especially if we see development continue to roll. We've only been increasing since 2010 as we move forward. So we really want to be sure that as we're considering what is needed for the region, that we're keeping those things in mind.
Before you go on, do you have reasons why that land didn't develop?
You know,
Housing collapse.
Well, no, but I mean,
Yeah.
since then, it still hasn't developed, is that what you're saying?
right.
So, do we know why?
I'd have to look in more, we'd have to look in more deeply. That was just pulling up, well, how is it today? We could go into further investigation. There's probably a variety of reasons that it hasn't developed. And I will say very broadly, it's for not just residential uses, there may be commercial or industrial uses that are part of that too. Some of it just might be slow to pick up. I'm thinking about even more recently with changes in financial markets and increasing cost of construction, that some of those projects that might have penciled out in 2018 probably stopped penciling out in 2021 as an example where they just couldn't make it work. But we can definitely look into that.
It makes,
global pandemic in there.
Yeah, there's that too.
but it makes me think of like Burnsville had a whole bunch of land along Interstate 35 that wasn't developing because they had planned it for like big corporate campuses and things, and nobody wanted to do that.
Mhm.
And then they changed it to be able to do it as apartment buildings, and it just, everything developed, so, you
That's a
know.
good point. Well, we certainly can dig in deeper and look at what is left and how it's guided, and see if we can get some additional information of what might be driving that. Either way, it's still a lot of land that was added that didn't result in development yet. Maybe it will someday, but not knowing that. But before we jump in, are there any other questions that folks have on any of that history or how we got here?
So, if I may, Madam Chair, so you indicated we have enough land in the 7-county metro for over 100 years development.
I will even slim that up. Within the urban service area, I've currently guided densities for over 100 years. Yes.
Okay. I think that's an important message to communicate externally, because most people do not perceive that. And then, do you know the percentage of metro area that is developed? Is it at 60% or lower?
I was just looking at that this morning. We are roughly half of our region is agricultural or considered undeveloped, like it's not being actively farmed somewhere in the rural area. So might have a house on it or something like that, but largely undeveloped. And the rest of that, the other half of that is some form of urbanized development, residential, commercial, industrial, airports, roads, that type of thing.
So it's 50%?
About 50%. From our
Yeah,
last.
you wouldn't perceive that
Right. I think.
driving across the metro.
Right, I think that there is definitely a perception that I think folks don't necessarily know where the metro ends either. And that we do have a lot of rural area that's a portion, that is a part of the metro area. And within the MUSA though, we still have a lot of undeveloped land within the planned areas that are planned for development, and those are where we're looking at that capacity ability. And there was a point I was gonna make that maybe will come to me later.
I think it becomes, if we're going to constrain things, it becomes more and more important to understand if that other land is actually available. Like the farm in Bloomington that just won't develop by the Mall of America, you know? Maybe someday, I don't know, you know? There's a lot of those sorts of properties where they could develop, but just have chosen not to, and you can't make people develop their land if they don't want to.
Yeah, certainly. Knowing how much capacity we have too, this isn't just for the developing edge, it also is inclusive of all cities. You know, our more urbanized communities that don't have greenfield and are looking at redevelopment, just using the land supply that they've also identified in their local plans for redevelopment is a part of that capacity. So there's definitely gonna be folks across the whole landscape who are like, yeah, you're not gonna make me develop. And even with that, even if we say it's like about 20% of that, then we still have 80 years of land supply. If we, you know, even estimate a certain amount, but no, that does get more difficult to understand, you know, individual property owners and whatnot. But I think it's certainly a purpose of one of our considerations on having that 20-year rolling land supply is ensuring that we're not only looking just 5 years out, but ensuring that we have like, yep, if we've got 20 years within this, that gives us some flexibility to work around if there's folks who are not interested in development at all. Should I walk through these maybe then? So these are some considerations as we are thinking about these criteria for requests to expand the urban service area, to add new land to the service area where we hadn't previously planned for that at a regional or local scale. And so these are not meant to be all-inclusive, but really are just some initial thoughts that are really reflecting on some of the considerations that the council used to use that have fallen off over time through various iterations of the regional development guide that may continue to have value today, as well as some other considerations, and we're certainly open to hearing other ideas for things that we should consider when we're considering these requests in order, I think, to go back to, as I was saying earlier, to be mindful of maintaining both enough land supply, but also ensuring that we're not oversupplying because that does lead to more investment in our system that may be premature. At the top is really thinking about, for those requests of inclusion of new areas, was demonstrating that need for a forecast change, that they're kind of similar to what I had mentioned earlier, that there's a demonstrated regional need for additional land. And usually when we see in local plans that we do have, that you've already planned to accommodate your forecast, so if you're adding new land, it should be because you need more land to accommodate more forecasts than you had anticipated. So we are proposing that as sort of as something for your consideration, including, as I mentioned, both that rolling land supply consideration, both regionally and locally. So we really want to recognize that there are going to be differences in development trends across different parts of the region. I talked about, you know, growth up the I-94 corridor. There's a lot of push for development in that part of the region and not so much in other parts of the region. So I think really being mindful that there are local submarkets, if you will, that maybe at the regional scale we look like we're okay, but locally we may not be, and we may have development trends that want to push that further. Similar to a previous cycle, the second consideration is around fulfillment of previous conditions related to council authorization of a comprehensive plan or plan amendment, and fulfillment of various program participation like plant monitoring program or like building permit survey to really show your math so we can be a part of that. The third one is related to that past performance has met density expectations that were in place at the time that we're looking at performance. Recognizing that performance the density expectation can change from planning cycle to planning cycle. So we might also consider a shorter look back for performance too, so we're not kind of looking too far back. Or measuring only performance against rules in place that are at that time too. I think one of the things that we think about is whether, as an option where we have sometimes communities who aren't meeting a minimum density expectation in their development patterns, or as we see them in plant monitoring program, falling short of that 3 units per acre and then come in for a request for additional land. How do we want to consider that? Do we want to consider that? So that was something we want to put forward. And then really defining how we calculate capacity within our regional wastewater system. We used to more clearly define this in our policy, or what we consider as land capacity. And that fell out of the, I think, 2030 regional development framework. A lot of things fell out of the regional development framework for 2030. A lot of the detail on how do we do this, or some of those other items. But maybe revisiting that when we're looking at capacity to show, like, do we need this additional land to support the region's growth, that we're clear that we're not including in your land capacity these areas, which is really consistent with how we do capacity calculation for plant monitoring. But even more specific is that limited depth to bedrock, because that does limit an ability to actually put a pipe in the ground when you are sitting right on top of bedrock. That's something that the Water Resources Plan several decades ago used to identify as one of those limitations. There may be other things that we talked about today, or other things in your head that you might want to offer too, but I'm happy to open it up for discussion.
Discussion? Phil?
Just curious, thank you, Madam Chair. So any adjustments to the comp guide plan, they have to be approved by the Met Council, they cannot be approved administratively?
That is not true. Changes to the comprehensive plan, so certain amendments can be authorized by staff. The council has delegated that administrative review authority to staff on certain types of plan amendments.
Okay.
But additions to the MUSA aren't one of those.
Got it.
Unless the council changes their policy.
Okay.
Anybody else? I've been hearing concerns about stormwater ponding being not netted out. And particularly where you have a development where a stormwater pond may serve a broader area, it will put that neighborhood at a disadvantage.
We do net out publicly owned stormwater management. And the reason that we focus on that publicly owned, and this was one that we had brought in as an amendment to our MUSA implementation guidelines in the mid-2010s. I can't remember which year, but was because we do want to encourage that best practice of implementing stormwater BMPs. And our environmental services colleagues had shared too that when they're in people's backyards or they're not publicly owned and managed, then they start to lose that functionality that they were meant to have. And so they're like, if we want to give credit for it, we want to be sure that it grows and maintains over time. So they are included when they are they are excluded from density when they are publicly owned.
Because I've seen plats in Andover where the property lines go all the way to the middle of the pond, and I don't support doing that, but maybe we need to make it more clear to people that you can cut your density, you're down significant, or make your density numbers much better by putting those under an easement or an outlot or something, and it makes it easier to maintain them too, because you make sure you have access to them to maintain. But it would be nice if we could treat everybody
Mhm.
the same, and if that's what it takes, is just, hey, replat these as outlots, great, but it doesn't seem like that message is getting through, because we're still getting complaints about it.
Yeah, and I think that's part of that is we see we definitely have a lot of changes in staff over time too, so we're always having to come back and kind of restart that and re-educate and redo that work, and certainly that's something that Angela's team does a lot of as well, and really encouraging local staff to be in touch early in the process too, especially when we're on that developing edge where net density is, where that subdivision is happening. So that we can help advise on those things before they've already gone through the full approval process. Certainly definitely want to be a resource for that, but there are other broader communication things we can do too.
No?
Thank you. Some are privately owned, publicly maintained. In fact, most stormwater catch basins, that's the way I'm seeing them, they were platted out. So how would you differentiate that?
Well, we usually see what we look for in plat monitoring, so this is outside of the MUSE expansion criteria, because we don't at that point where people are coming in to ask for expansion, they're don't usually have a plat, that would be premature for them to have a plat ready at that point. But for when we're looking at net density in that plat monitoring program, when we look at that subdivision, we see that there are outlets, we also ask them, the local staff, to make sure that they're identifying, are those outlets owned by, continue to be privately owned, or those publicly owned, which ones are, some outlets are reserved for future development, so it's not always clear when we get the plat information, so that's the work that our staff do when they're working one-on-one with teams as we're reviewing that information and verifying.
So again, on that topic, and it is considerable, especially since we've had heavy rains, I think 20 years ago, so the stormwater catch basins are significant in some areas, and I've never seen a drop of water in them. So I'm just wondering the consistency and driving the issue from a Met Council to make sure they're subdivided, that instead of the individual lot going to the center would be more consistent, or I think the Met Council should drive a policy that would be more consistent across the whole urban area.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I know, in Hugo, I know that when we do a subdivision, excuse me, we'll have just one large stormwater pond that serves the whole area. And then from there, we use irrigation to help draw water out of that for irrigation for the community or for the HOA. We did try some smaller ones that we went back and because they were developed, we used the smaller ones. So we were able to use the smaller, the ones that were initially put in those developments, and they're working okay. But it's more preferable to have the bigger stormwater ponds as opposed to have these little individual ones all over the place. It's a lot less to maintain, and you're right, sometimes it's public, sometimes it's private. We just try to work together on that.
Yeah, I certainly can share that with our water resources colleagues. They're the professionals in that regard. We're just on the land counting side.
If I may. Thank you, Madam Chair. The other thing too is, doesn't some of this have to do with what the market is actually driving for? I mean, as far as units per acre. We're finding that homes are wanting to get closer and closer together, and like now we're getting down like 15 feet apart, and I think they had to put them together. But they're trying to squeeze as many units per acre as possible, these developers. That's because of the cost of the land that you're trying to purchase. And so really, isn't it the market that's really driving the units per acre as opposed to what us trying to mandate?
So on densities, certainly, there is a drive. We have seen the market respond and Merritt will talk more about that around transit station areas in particular. And we do see the market pushing for higher densities in a lot of areas. And then on the flip side, it's also our responsibility to ensure that we get minimal efficiency out of our wastewater system, right? At the lowest, worst case scenarios, lowest densities that we still are in our 3 units an acre or 4 units an acre going forward. But also, as I had mentioned earlier, that we're efficiently managing this public investment and the land supply around it. So we're more, as we're thinking about additional land, as we expect requests to come in, or at least defining those, how we would respond to requests for more land to be added to the MUSA. We want to be clear and transparent about how we might consider those requests. And maybe things drop off and we have a crash, I don't know, we keep hearing there's a recession around the corner, right? So maybe there is, and maybe we don't ever have to use a policy, but if we do if we do get requests for additional land, we want to take a very mindful approach about how we would do that and be transparent about how we would consider that.
Okay, Madam Chair.
so,
The other question I have too is, just from a geographical standpoint, some of these areas are not gonna be able to put sewer lines in. Has that been shown on the maps? Do you know where those locations are at? Because I know in, like, eastern Hugo.
Yeah.
That's a swamp.
I remember your analysis, right?
That's a swamp. I mean, it's, so that's, there's not a lot of substructure there to help hold pipes up. Has that been like that?
Yeah, I know that there were some areas that our colleagues in environmental services have looked at. I think when we consider these types of requests, is that those are the things that we would expect locals to also look at. Like you had done in the case of Hugo, that additional analysis is something that you have, requires much more digging in and looking into and actually assessing your landscape in a way that we really want to partner and rely on your local expertise in the area too. So that, I think that's maybe something else. Right now, we talk about, and calculating that land capacity, why are we bringing in this land? I have wetlands in there, but the height of the water table is a big part of that.
issue,
Yeah.
It's a major issue.
Yeah,
Yes, it
so
is.
maybe that's an addition that we add to that last consideration. Proximity or depth to water table, not just.
has there been any discussion of looking at the sort of the delta between the land values inside the MUSA and outside the MUSA? And then also looking at what is land going for outside the 7-county metro area and developable areas, so that we're not driving people out cost-wise, especially with the ability to work remotely, that's easier and easier to do. And then there's no rules, they don't have 3 units per acre.
They have other rules, but not ours.
Not that, yeah, but a lot fewer rules.
Right.
And there's been a certain amount of risk to the land in the rural areas because it's kind of artificially depressed value-wise because of the 1/40 zoning in some places, which puts it at risk of, like, there's just a big auction lot that opened up down by Randolph.
Yeah.
Because the land was cheap, so you could,
Just pave it over and put stuff on it. Yeah.
Right, and so you're not necessarily saving farmland, you may be opening it up that it ends up being a giant solar farm or other things that aren't agriculture too, just because the land value is so low that it's like, well, what the heck, why don't I just buy that?
I was going to question that. I know of no farmland that's low. Compared to 10 years ago.
Well,
It's crazy, the prices.
land, not necessarily great agricultural land, but marginal agricultural land is definitely at risk.
And we have looked at that land value difference, and I think Councilmember, you're familiar with some of that work that we did as part of our parks planning, because we do have planning for how much it's gonna cost to build out the system for acquisitions within the MUSA and outside the MUSA are very different. And some of that is a a lot of that is a reflection of investments that we've already made in that land, right? It is worth more because it has services associated with it. It was a conversation I had with some site selectors who were asking, they're like, how come we can't get sewer over here? Like, what land are you talking about? And they were showing me some land in like Eureka Township. We're like, that's because there's no services land over there. That's why, they're like, but it was cheap. I'm like, that's why it was cheap, because there's no services planned for there. I'm like, yeah, you are gonna pay more for you are gonna pay more for land in the NUSA because that land, but that doesn't reflect the local services necessarily being available yet either.
Right, but when the land gets squeezed too much, the price will start to jump very rapidly.
Right.
If I could though, Madam Chair, back to your original comment, we have enough supply for 100 years or 80 years. So if people are buying up counties, it's like Jerry says often, hey, you have county governments or local communities. If they decide to plow up rich farmland for development, we don't control that out of the urban core. That's sort of a policy for outstate communities, more or less. And you know, the free market operates. I always find it interesting when you have farmland within the urban core. We shouldn't allow development until that person gets older and wants to sell it. Then why don't we allow it? And I've seen that the 20 years I was mayor.
Yeah, but this, we're not talking about market forces, we're talking about, do we wanna have something limiting those market forces in order to connect them?
I would say more, what are the criteria we should consider when we face a request for adding land to the NUSA?
And I think land availability is of course a big one, and acknowledging the local thing, cause you know, Mrs. Anderson could have developed her farm on Ipava, she developed part of it, but she's got 7 acres left that it is not being redeveloped. And it was 20 years ago that she developed the rest of the place. I'm pretty sure Mrs. Anderson has to be dead by now, unless she's like 112. But, you know, there are places where they just won't. And so having the locals kind of inventory what is actually available for development. And Farmington is doing that right now. They're doing a comp plan update. Because they didn't actually ask the farmers and landowners around them the last time, do you want to develop? They just put colors on a map and then went, oh, maybe we need to make sure that that land is actually available. And so if there is, you know, a need and you're obeying the rules, then people should be able to, I think, add in.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
Madam Chair, I guess the only other thing would be just what I brought up earlier was geographically, can you even build there?
Yeah.
Is there anything on this list that you're like, no way, that's a red flag, don't do that?
You know, Madam Chair, I gotta commend you for having even the statement of their shorter look-back periods are based on past policies. I'd say most local governments would argue with you in the past, and that's a great statement to have in there, so that, oh, that's reasonable. And I applaud you.
Yeah, because if you put somebody in a position where what they did in 1980 is going to doom them forever, you're not.
Correct.
Right.
Any other thoughts? You look like you're thinking really, really hard, Jerry.
Well, I'm always trying to think. Trying to keep up with all the information you get down here, but do you really think there's enough land here for 80 years out there at the present rate of building?
Yeah, not only at our present rate of building, but just on our overall trends. And in how the market has been responding and what local governments have been doing and supporting that development, and that we have been seeing that sort of land consumption per household as our region has grown trend downward and flatten out a bit. And that's over 15, 20 years, so we are seeing progress in that way. And we've been seeing, just reviewing the 2040 comprehensive plans, just that planning for increased density and more variety and density in the urban service area has really increased the capacity to support growth within those areas as well.
Well,
If I may, I think the other thing that will heavily influence, family units are smaller continually. 65 and older, 2 years ago, we passed 18 and under. It's at 14%, will be at 22 by 2045. So about 1 out of 4 people 20 years from now are 65 and older. So somebody's gonna get squeezed on all these 2-story single family homes as you try to turn them over 20 years from now. Just a piece of advice if you're out there buying. One level is a secure investment, but that heavily influences the densities.
yeah.
Yes.
So you're seeing the densities not only on the young end that can't afford a home, but also on the 65 and older or 50 and older. The higher density is a good thing today.
We hear more about retirement oriented developments where folks are like, I would like to have a lawn, but I don't have to take care of it,
Yeah.
kind of
Right.
thing.
Oh, yeah.
A small enough house, but within a shared association, that is becoming more and more of a trend too, and detached as well as attached.
Right.
If you have extra time and you're interested, our staff gave an update yesterday to our council on population trends that talk a lot about those things as well. Happy to talk a lot about how our populations have been changing in the last couple of years and what we're seeing in those population changes around the region too.
And it has data for every single city of how many occupied units there are of different types of housing, at least as of
Earlier this year.
April 1st of 2023. So you could, it's really kind of fascinating to read. You can look up for each city how many people are in single family, duplex, triplex, etc., townhomes, apartments.
homes.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It shows how many there are and what the occupancy rate is, so.
So that's on the planning?
Yeah, I can.
We can send out
we can send
the
it to the
information.
whole-
Yeah, if you would. Love data.
And then the other thing that this group has not heard yet is that staff is proposing to increase the minimum density for the suburban edge area to 4 from 3 to 5. We had a presentation on densities, what, February here?
I think that we've had special meetings to talk about density long since February,
Okay,
so we've been talking about it at every meeting.
But the table that had all the proposed densities for the communities was not given to this group. That was given to community development, and I have some concerns about what going from 3 to 4 as a minimum would do, but maybe that's something that you guys would like to hear more about. I don't know, have feelings about, Phil?
Yeah, actually, I was looking through some of that, and I did bring it up to one of our staff, and they have a concern with it, big time. They'd like to be more flexible. I mean, it's one of the purposes, was it from 2007, allow more flexibility, local flexibility. I think we need to continue with that. The market's really going to really drive what goes in as far as development, be it commercial, be it residential. It says respond to market forces. I mean, that to me is to stay where we're at with 2007, the implementation guidelines should be the same.
And cities have been responding to the desire for increased density overall as a region. That densities have gone up because cities are doing what the market drives.
But, if I may, Madam Chair, and I agree with you, that's true, but I think a lot of that has to do with land prices, and because of the cost of the land, you're seeing more density on those properties that are being purchased, so.
Yeah, and my fear is that if we go too high with that bottom number, it just drives up the price of land and makes it harder for people to have a single family home.
Yes.
We need to have choices for
I agree.
people. Bill?
I would like or be interested in that. Now, I'd say the market, even 5.5 setbacks for young people, that's no big deal to them. So, not anybody that's under 30, 40, that's small lot maintenance. But I do think, instead of maybe lowering that, to put a bonus in there for the community some way.
Like?
I don't know.
Repeats.
But, what would that be in a land use planning that you'd get lower SAC rates?
No. Oh, yeah.
Sure. All in favor?
Jerry?
But isn't housing, the particular housing that's being built, isn't that really more to do with local control over zoning and everything?
Well, but when we set the minimum density, that kind of guides what local zoning has for an option.
How did, Met Council doesn't sit there with a big club. You say, you're gonna do this. Is the Met Council's power in that, well, if you wanna use our pipes, you have to kind of go along with our guidelines? Is that how that works?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
And then a point though, I wanna be clear about flexibility too, is that we don't propose changing the flexibility that we currently have on how local decisions are made around where to guide development, at what intensity to guide it. We're just asking for that overall average minimum density across your community to meet that, the same as we have in 2040, that's not changing. It's still at that community-wide average. And then considering, you can still have lower and higher within that.
But it's not the same because your community-wide, your community average would be 4 rather than having a minimum of 3.
Right, I was talking more about the flexibility not changing. That's the part that is the same.
Well, how much, excuse me.
Yes,
Well,
Jerry?
when you're talking about future development, what's the capacity the Met Council has now? How many more housing or units or whatever you use, what facilities you have now before you have to expand those?
That's kind of a rolling answer because
Yeah.
we build our plants to meet capacity. They're expandable, but they meet the current capacity plus maybe 20 years, and then we just expand them as we need to farther out. The pipes are built to be way bigger than they need to be so that you don't have to go back and dig them up, but those were planned based on the minimum of 3, and I don't know if staff has done any analysis on what 4 would do to that.
It doesn't change, they're actually based on volume. So the land that goes into it is more of a land efficiency issue rather than a density issue. Now that's gonna be different and obviously a more urbanized sense because the sewer sheds are smaller. The sewer sheds are larger, the further out you go, and it depends on where the local pipes come in. So they're not overly defined yet, especially for greenfield. But it's the volume of flow that comes into them is what we plan for.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm assuming today that the growth in the region the last few years, you're able to pay off the bonds without using operation dollars, correct? At one time when we had
Oh, yeah, we have
housing,
an excess of SAC, there's a huge reserve in SAC right now.
so that's changed in
Yes.
the last,
Because
10
of
years.
growth coming back,
It's boomed right up, right, exactly. Versus where we were digging out of when development was very low.
Which is a little bit tied to Jerry's question, because you expand the treatment facilities and issue the bonds
Right.
according to what the projected growth is.
Right, and in coordination with what is planned in local plans as well.
Yeah.
Because that's our commitment, that authorization of a local plan is our commitment to provide those services and with the timing and staging that's identified.
Okay,
Okay, well, thank you, I really appreciate your feedback and input and
Hopefully we
We should
didn't
take
talk
our-
too long and we still have time for his review.
45 minutes probably to go.
big topic.
We can.
That's it.
Chair, if I could,
Yes.
I just want to introduce everyone to a new staff member that we have on our team. This is Mara Clapp Smith. This is her first time in front of this committee. Although this week has been busy, this isn't her first presentation at the council already. So she started in May. Mara has a long history working at local governments, working for many years at the City of St. Paul. She also has worked in rural areas all throughout as a consultant as well. So that's just super brief in her illustrative career, but she's here today to share some transit station area density analysis.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, happy to be here. Today we're going to look at the current Thrive 2040 requirements for transit station areas and the targets for residential densities in those areas. How those are comparing to observed development around the stations and possible modification of station area density policy to better align with the market and transit supportive activity. This map shows current minimum density requirements for transit station areas around the region. And the densities that were set under Thrive 2040 vary by mode type and community designation. So for instance, for light rail transit, the densities for those stations are higher. They are highest in the urban center. As you move outward through community designations, the required minimum densities go lower. This table shows current density requirements and targets around station areas. And it's a lot to look at first glance, so I'm going to break it down. Thrive 2040 requirements and targets vary according to the mode of transportation and community type. So transit modes on this table are shown as rows and community types are shown as columns. For each community type and mode, you see a minimum required density, that's the first column within each community type. And then you see target densities, minimum and maximum for each mode and designation as well. For instance, under urban center, light rail transit station, kind of towards the upper left, you see a minimum required density currently under our policy of 50 dwelling units per acre. And then there's target densities that range between 75 and 150. So the target densities in Thrive 2040 were meant to be aspirational. The minimum required density would have been something that would have had to have been reflected in their comprehensive plans around station areas. You can also see the geography of the areas that are included for station areas are different by mode. So it's a half-mile radius for some types of stations, quarter-mile radius for arterial BRT, and a quarter-mile along the corridor for high-frequency bus. And I just want to note on this table, suburban edge was inclusive also of emerging suburban edge, so the requirements and targets for those two community designations are the same. These images from Thrive 2040 visualizing density information show regional examples of residential densities that are around 10 units per acre. These densities represent the current required minimums for most of the highway BRT stations and all of the high-frequency bus station areas. So you can see the minimum requirements now really reflect single-family or very low-density townhome development.
I have a question for you
Yeah.
before you move on from this. So
Yep.
when you're figuring this, like the Maplewood one, are you going by the size of the lot is 1/8 of an acre or less, or are you going by the platted density?
I believe it's by the platted density.
Okay. Because when neighborhoods are initially platted, it includes the street in the density, so I just wanted to make sure we're having an apples to apples for, in
Mhm.
greenfields,
Right.
we're used to that, but in developed areas, people just look at what is the size, how many square feet is the lot?
Right, yeah, these are done on more of that macro scale.
Okay.
Next image you see here are densities falling between 15 and 25 dwelling units per acre. That is what most of the stations currently in the regional system are required for minimum densities. So you can see that's light rail, commuter rail, dedicated BRT in urban, suburban, and suburban edge, highway BRT for urban center, and arterial BRT for all designations. So again, these images would be reflective of development that would be meeting those requirements. And finally, we have some images here showing between 30 and 50 dwelling units per acre. The only minimum requirements we currently have that are over 25, it's a minimum of 50 dwelling units per acre for light rail, commuter, and dedicated BRT in urban center communities. Imagine 2050 is going to advance its commitment to transit supportive density around station areas that's reflective of market potential and realities. So to understand what's possible, council research tabulated the density of all new development, residential development that occurred around station areas between 2009 and 2023. The residential building permits provided kind of average project densities within each community by station type. And there were 2,650 residential building permits that were in this data set that was examined. And I'll just note that during this period of development, about 40% of all multifamily units built in the region were built within station areas. This table shows how new development compares on average, new development being between that 2009-2023, how those development densities are comparing to current minimum required and target densities for station areas. So based on the permit data, all developments for stations, according to mode and community type, were averaged to determine if the market is producing development densities that lag, meet, or exceed the Thrive 2040 residential density requirements and targets. So as you look across the table, the blue cells show where recent residential development meets or exceeds the target densities. The darkest blue shows where average development is exceeding the maximum targets, and lighter blue is where it's meeting or exceeding the minimum targets. Yellow cells show areas where development is exceeding or meeting the minimum requirements. And then the 3 orange cells show where recent development on average has not met minimum requirements. I do want to note that in the data set of all of that development observed in station areas, that is inclusive of station areas that are already built, but also station areas that are still in the planning and engineering phase. That makes up almost half of the development that we see in station areas is for the transit investments that aren't even on the ground yet. So when we're looking at what we're seeing in the development marketplace around these stations, we're seeing that the market is really bringing development that is exceeding where the requirements are for minimum densities in Thrive 2040. And that if we're looking to revisit the requirements and the targets for Imagine 2050, it would be very safe to bump up those minimum requirements just to even begin to meet where we're seeing most of the market development occurring. So we have some potential options that you can consider for Imagine 2050. One would be to increase minimum requirements to better align with the development market. Could simplify station area density policy by focusing on minimum requirements and perhaps not advancing target densities, which are aspirational. And then another is to look for opportunities to simplify the variation between all the requirements across modes and community type. So for instance, when I'm looking at the data sets, there tend to be groups of certain types of densities that are occurring around certain modes, so it may be possible to not have quite as much variation between them. I'd also like to note that in addition to residential density being a really important factor for success for transit and in station areas, they also benefit from proximity to a mix of uses. And the draft transportation policy plan identifies mixed use as an important element of transit success, making it both more cost effective and competitive for funding. So Imagine 2050, the draft TPP already is using the activity level guidelines that were introduced in 2040 to talk more globally about the importance of having not just residential, but also commercial, educational activities, amenities, commerce around station areas. And so that discussion will continue, but putting kind of a mixed use activity level into a metric is much more challenging than looking at a residential density metric like we do now. So with that, I'd like to open it up for discussion. A couple things to consider. Does increasing minimum required residential densities make sense? What are the most important considerations in considering new minimums? And then should the target densities be retained or dropped from Imagine 2050? Thank you.
Phil?
I have a question as far as, the densities, that's nice, but what is the ridership?
That's a great question, and I have been speaking with someone on staff that looks at ridership models, and they are doing some modeling, and they are going to continue to do modeling of that information. The ridership of a certain line depends on a lot of different factors, but the residential density and activity density in general definitely is highly correlated with kind of the success of ridership.
Madam Chair. No, the reason I ask is,
Yeah.
the densities, I know that there's some BRT stations that are out there, and I drive by them, and they're empty.
Yeah.
And so I question, first of all, the expansion of more use of some of this stuff, especially the rail. I'm not a huge fan of it. I think it's a waste of money, but that is what it is. But the more density we have, that's nice to look at density, but if we don't have more ridership, then what's the point? People have to be able to walk to where they want, they have to be able to walk to these locations, make it so it's easy. I think just recently on the TV, they talked about, was it a micro or a mini bus transit system? Micro, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That they're starting to implement, and that seems to be relatively successful. Maybe it's something that we could see more ridership with that and help maybe support some of this larger stuff. I just question housing, the density, that's going to be really a good benchmark.
A little out of my lane here on the expertise on my.
Sorry.
Anybody else? I guess my observation would be, like you said, it's really hard to get at the commercial or whatever side of things, but that's where things fall apart if they're going to, like, Apple Valley Red Line area, they had a movie theater go belly up, and instead of putting transit-oriented development there, it's now a big box flooring store.
Missed opportunity.
Well, it was a deliberately missed
Yeah.
opportunity. Bill?
Thank you, Madam Chair. In fact, yesterday at TAB, MVTA, the micro or dial-a-ride, so 30%. So I would say cities, looking down the road, and I just threw out the aging demographics, higher density area, the somewhat, and Metro Transit's tri-lane in the North Metro, a dial-a-ride type service. So as you look at that across the country, I think clearly it's going to change in the next decade or two. And having higher density areas of development, you can put circulator routes, vans, buses every 10 minutes, and you'll have great ridership.
Yes, I agree.
It's just that our service, mostly Red Line, was designed for that Minneapolis, St. Paul work centers, and they disappeared 3 or 4 years ago with COVID. So it's a changing system, but I would say still that density is needed to provide that service that will get people out of the car.
Yes.
So you have opportunities.
And I recall that having the upper end on those density targets was kind of to help out our wastewater folks so that you didn't make things so dense in spots that you overload the wastewater system. Because there's been places where we've had to do very, very expensive expansions to the wastewater system in places where that density was never expected and then suddenly appeared. And it's not always transit that drives that, like the area by Highway 100 and 394, used to be very, very low density, and then it just went nuts with everything being redeveloped there, and we actually had to slow down the pace of redevelopment to put in a $30 million pipe to deal with the extra capacity that was needed there. So I think, considering sewer capacity, not just as a whatever we build, we're gonna make a big enough pipe, but try to be mindful on the top end of the densities as well as the bottom end in terms of cost effectiveness is a factor.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I'll note that, these are density requirements and targets right around the station areas. Communities still have to consider that overall growth and the volume and how that relates to their infrastructure capacity. So this is kind of at the micro level within those communities, but so if they're pushing at kind of those maximum targets on the in the station areas, they're going to have to offset that to make sure that on whole they're aligning with the infrastructure.
I agree with Mayor. And Chair, if I could just add one other thing about the maximums, is that you may have a better memory than me, but this is my recollection, is that the target densities were really based on kind of a national standard analysis of what is which is supportive development around those station areas. So I think that was more a reflection of analysis, not maybe just strictly related to our systems, the minimums for sure.
No, it was both.
Okay.
Because that was, before there was always just minimum densities that cities were required to do, and adding in that maximum was a result of some places that just got way too much for the pipes.
We did do that for the general residential density, that's correct, yeah. We did make sure maximums were shown, yes.
Yes. Noah, did you have something? I saw you move out of the corner of the eye.
Sorry.
Yeah, I've just been wondering like how this relates to the previous presentation and the amount of land forecasted to be available 80 or 100 years out. Is the assumption that the amount of redevelopment increases as time moves forward as well, and that's included in that projection? Or is that, is it just talking about raw land without an increase in redevelopment or that sort of thing?
Thank you. I'll lend Merritt a hand here since I know that analysis better. That analysis is based on planned land uses, not just greenfield development, but also redevelopment as defined and identified in local comprehensive plans. So we're not projecting any additional land for redevelopment or saying that areas that aren't already defined for development would come onto that, but just as it's identified today in the local plans that we've authorized.
Okay, thanks.
Bill,
Thank you. I go back to a question you asked earlier with outer ring development expanding NUSA. By upping the number, will you be increasing the price of the land on these corridors?
What we're seeing is that the market's already bringing these densities, so that's probably already having that effect on the land values. I mean, these station areas are seen as a really good investment by developers.
Yeah.
And that's why they're gravitating towards them.
But I'd still say that question could be out there. As you go higher, there's value.
well, and I've heard from people who are trying to build along the Green Line in St. Paul, towards Minneapolis, that it can be a challenge to get the land because it's mixed use, so everybody thinks they're gonna be the market rate, high density apartment, no matter what somebody wants to put on the land, so they end up not building anything because the price is too high to do what they wanted to do, because everybody wants to be the one that gets the big check. Having come from St. Paul, did you see that at all, or?
I think land speculation's been around for hundreds of years. What I observed, I've been in St. Paul my whole life and lived near Grand Avenue, and that's a perfect example of where I think a lot of times the investors are seeing big profits, and sometimes those profits don't materialize, so you have cycles where people are really pushing up the land values, and then if the market's not responding or you're not getting people that can afford those rents, then eventually it'll kind of tamp it down a bit. So I think that's just kind of the nature of land speculation.
So I'm not hearing any strong feelings one way or the other about TOD densities. Jerry?
Well, I've got a problem with number one up there. Now, you tell me if I'm wrong. It wasn't like light rails and everything designed because everybody was gonna go downtown to work and that all fizzled, right? Or no? So, what I read and hear, the council wants everybody to put in apartment buildings along light rails, but where are they going with? If you live there, where are you gonna go? Nobody works downtown anymore for various reasons. So having all these minimum densities and everything just seems to complicate everything to me. I don't know. What, am I wrong? What am I missing here?
Well, there are people that still have places to go along the line or elsewhere in the transit system, but this is more about future development, mostly along the existing lines. I mean, Blue Line is still kind of up in the air, but as far as LRT, it's more the redevelopment along the existing Green Line extension and the existing Blue Line.
Yes, I accept that, but why? I mean, do people really live in an apartment next to the rail?
A lot of people do,
They
yeah,
do,
there
really.
are a lot of people that are renting those apartments.
Oh, and where do they go on?
I wanna find
I mean,
out.
do they go 5 blocks to the grocery store and then come back, or what?
If I may, we have a condo in downtown St. Paul, we're just 3 blocks from here. And my daughter recently moved home a few years after graduating from college, and she's moved back into our condo because she's going to medical school at the University of Minnesota, and it's super convenient for her to live there and walk 3 blocks to the train to commute to and from school. So people like her are still, finding the value.
Chair, if I could also add.
Sure.
I will maybe just offer that we're literally in a downtown right now, so people are still working in downtowns, the employment centers are still very active, and of course there's a change after the pandemic, there's a lot more work from home, but you'll still see many office spaces being used on the regular, so I wouldn't say that it's desolate in any kind of downtown, it's still very active. And jobs aren't the only thing that are down there. There's recreation, entertainment, cultural activities, public spaces, public events, and all other kinds of things as well. And people use the trains for baseball, games, for, all kinds of recreation as well.
Yeah, and there are some people that lived in the suburbs until their kids graduate from high school, and then they move downtown to have better access to restaurants and events and whatnot. There's lots of different things that people can choose to do, and those apartment buildings are filling up.
Yes, they are.
They are.
They wouldn't build them if they didn't have to get people into them. Because unlike single-family homes, you have to figure out ahead of time what your occupancy is gonna be to decide whether you can afford to make your payments. And if you're not gonna be able to fill it up, with a house, you can build one and then sell it, build another one, or build 10 and, sell those and build 10 more. But with an apartment building, you gotta know that it's gonna pencil out in the long run if you're gonna put up all that money. And so there's a pretty sophisticated system that they use to figure out, are they gonna find people that wanna pay rent that makes the project viable?
Can I just ask for a little bit more direction
Sure.
or guidance? So Merritt said very clearly that the market is driving the minimums essentially, surpassing the minimum requirements in most cases. So if we need to set minimum densities within transit station areas for Imagine 2050. We can keep things static, but that's not reflective of the market. So does it make the most sense to adjust those minimum density requirements to reflect what the market is already producing?
And my question would be, you looked at it averaging over the whole thing, but the individual developments, are there some that are way outliers and stuff? And if they are, is that a problem or is it not?
Yeah, the data I was working with aggregated like residential permits within a city for certain mode types, so it wasn't just individual. So there is variation between specific residential projects. But what these requirements are looking at is the development averaged over the stationary for new development, so you could still have higher and lower densities than where the requirement's at, as long as kind of they averaging that.
Okay,
It's the same approach as the
as
overall.
usage density.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I don't see any problem with inching them up. I don't know that the target densities really matter all that much if there's, they don't there's no enforcement mechanism to make people do them.
But I would just push, I think reflecting the market makes sense more than anything.
Yes.
And developers, investments, interest rates, the market and cost, I don't see it going down. I think if you project out, relatively speaking, I'd go higher.
And it is a substantial investment in the neighborhood, so
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's fair to have an expectation in return that you're going to
Yeah.
zone appropriately.
I heard Chair, you say that the target densities might not matter so much since we're already achieving them. I think what we had in Thrive was we didn't want to start at the targets because we wanted to ease into it, see what the market would do. So I think it might make sense not to have the targets anymore since we're achieving that minimum.
Right.
And that's what that national standard was, so we wanted to reflect that goal. And I think that communities and station areas largely have met it and achieved it. So
But
if you
what
were
I,
saying maybe not to have targets,
but what I said was,
okay,
the
yeah.
targets don't matter because we have no enforcement mechanism.
Well, yes, that's true.
Not that we were achieving them, but because we
Sure.
can't beat
I
people
inferred.
with a
I'm
club
so
if
sorry.
they don't, if they don't achieve them. But yeah, I don't see that they're necessary.
Okay, that was my question, thank you.
Yeah,
for
does
helping.
anybody else think we really need targets? Seeing a lot of shaking heads.
No.
Is that everything you needed, Mark?
Thank you very much.
Was there any other questions you had, felt like you needed more input on from the group?
No, that's great, thank you.
Okay.
That was easy.
Thank you.
I was gonna say, we got the answers, so you need them.
I'll try to be more challenging next time.
I would say one thing, Madam Chair, I think future meetings, especially when we talk density, to have some transit data would be beneficial.
Yeah, having not just the PowerPoint, but a memo with more underlying.
Where you're seeing trends, because it's a changing world last 2-3 years, and it's hard to keep up with.
And in places where you're getting that density, are you getting the ridership or are people
Yeah.
living
Yeah,
next to the
exactly.
train and not taking
Right.
it? Is
Right.
kind of what you're asking, right?
Especially if I'm at a city level, development level, it just assures what I think I know.
Yeah.
Right. We like data.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I just had one quick thing. This is an ongoing conversation, so while the council is approaching its public comment period, officially opening up on Imagine 2050, including all of the density work and all of the other stuff that you guys have been working on over the last couple of years, we want to make sure that you understand that that is just one point in time and that we'll continue to refine these conversations as we go forward. The council still continues to give us direction on this way or that way on different things, and so you'll see some of that stuff. So I know Chair Wolf mentioned that we didn't have the density table information in front of you, and I'm happy to bring that back at the next meeting. That'll still be before the public comment period closes, and we can still incorporate any feedback that you have.
Okay. Well, then you get an extra 12 minutes back of your life. Thank you everybody for your participation. With no further business to come before us, this meeting is adjourned.